Welcome to Inside Brussels, the European Conservatives news show from the European Parliament, where we discuss the latest political developments with MEPs and experts, giving you a conservative take on the biggest issues driving the day. In this episode, we'll take a look at Europe's giant rearmament plan and what could truly drive the sudden urge to take EU defense seriously, as well as why Brussels doesn't want the war in Ukraine to end. On one hand, we see Brussels failing to control the narrative after President Trump took charge of the Ukraine peace process, with Europe scoffing from the sidelines, but unable and unwilling to make any meaningful contribution to peace, only toward escalation. On the other hand, the EU is portraying America's more grounded and transactional foreign policy as a major crisis in order to exploit it at the expense of people and member states. It announced a giant €800 billion rearmament plan funded by joint debt, which would inevitably undermine member states' sovereignty in the long run. Having strong defense and deterrence capabilities is in the interest of every nation state. When push comes from Brussels, we need to ask a few questions first. Who will be in control of Europe's rearmament? Von der Leyen and her unelected bureaucrats? What do EU leaders who don't believe in sovereignty or democracy even want to defend, or other than their own power? And if push comes to shove, who is willing to fight for a Europe that's been treating patriotism as an enemy for decades? With everything happening so fast in Brussels and around the world, we invited some distinguished guests to explain us what's going on behind the scenes. Our first guest is former Italian General Roberto Vannacci, an MEP representing the Lega party. Then we will speak with Professor Frank Furedi, the director of the conservative think tank MCC Brussels, which has made a name for itself by publishing groundbreaking reports about the inner workings of the EU. And last but not least, András László, a Hungarian MEP from the ruling Fidesz party and a member of the Parliament's Civil Liberties Committee, will be joining us. Mr. Vannacci, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you to you, and thank you for the opportunity.
First, could you explain to our viewers how the ReArm Europe, especially the €150 billion SAFE program, would work?
Yes, so the ReArm Europe is divided in two tranches, if you want. 150 billion will be the common debt, and then you'll have 650 billion that will be used by each member states according to a waiver on the Pact of Stability. So the money that is going to be spent on defense will not be taken into account inside the Pact of Stability, but only for 4 years. And then you'll have to return back the money that you have loaned by the Commission or by other agents anyway. So it's a kind of loan that you can make with certain conditions, but at the end of the day, you will have to give back the money, and there is only two ways of doing that, is cutting the expenditure in your country, so cutting the welfare, or having new income, new taxes. So this is something that the citizens must know. It's not money that is just given to you, it's something that you just loan and then you'll have to give it back. And regarding the 150 billion, they're going to be a common debt made by the European Union and then loaned to the states. But the problem is always the same. So we are not very keen on accepting this common debt. First of all, because it erodes the sovereignty of each member state, because the money is given to you only if you respect and accept specific conditionalities that are established by the Commission. I'm talking about defense, which is an item that depends on each member state. In this way, the Commission erodes the sovereignty of the member states, as it did with COVID. We were not talking about wealth before, and now it became a European Union matters and item instead of remaining a specific competence of each member state. And secondly, we have a problem of scope. So this money is taken because someone said that we have an emergency. But in reality, we have no emergency. We haven't seen any Russian soldier marching in the European capitals. We haven't seen any attack by the Russian Federation against any member state of the European Union. We have a state of the European Union that is occupied by another state. It's Cyprus, and is occupied by Turkey. But we haven't seen any reaction by the European Union against this invasion that happened in 1974, for example. And then we have also the problem of the benefit. So when you loan the money and you create investment, you would like to have also some benefit from this investment because you create, for example, new jobs. You produce more manufactured products. But because of the characteristic of the defense industry that are based mainly on heavy and structured industries, the majority of these industries are in Germany and in France. So you loan money, you make work these industries that are in Germany and in France, and you don't have any benefit. And so that's why, principally, we are against this common loan. And finally, we have also the principle. Why do we need to spend more? Because in the last years, the price of the weapons and of the military hardware has increased by 150%, even more, because of the cost of the energy, because of the increase of the cost of the energy and the increase of the cost of the raw materials. And why the energy and raw materials have increased? Because of the war with Russia. So instead of spending more for weapons, because the price have increased, we had better to re-establish good relations with Russia, who was the major country that was providing energy and raw material to Europe before the war. Let's decrease the prices of the energy and raw materials, and then spending the same amount of money, having the possibility to buy more military hardware. So that's why we are not convinced absolutely of this ReArm Europe. We're not convinced about the emergency, and we are not convinced about the means and the procedures that are used to have this money and those investments.
Let me circle back to the point you made about these crises.
Yeah.
The Europe is famous for creating these crises or using them as tools for more centralization.
Absolutely.
And in your now famous speech in the plenary, you lectured von der Leyen about the real emergencies of Europe. What are those, and why is Brussels decide to ignore them?
Because Brussels is used to do so, and we have seen it, for example, with the Green Deal. All the European people had to die because of climate change, and so we spent a lot of money in the Green Deal because we thought that we were dying and nobody of us died. And it was even earlier about the COVID. We spent a lot of money for the vaccination and so on because we were all supposed to be dying because of the COVID. And now they have just changed the topic, and now the most important emergency is the invasion of Russian soldiers against the European Union, and they try to modify our way of understanding, creating a new emergency that in reality they do not exist.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's so funny that as soon as the war broke out, COVID disappeared.
Exactly. So that's one of the examples. And now, which is really strange and amazing, is that all the plan is based on the past and the present, but doesn't take into account the future. So the future will be peace. We are talking about peace. Trump, Putin, and Zelensky are meeting in the Arabic Peninsula and negotiating the peace. And we are still talking about war. We are still talking about rearmament. We are talking about defense. We are talking about invasions. In the contrary, on the other side, they are talking about commercial agreements. And they are talking about how to get out of this situation that has characterized the past and the present, but it's not the future that we are looking at.
Professor Furedi, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure talking to you.
A few talk about the great contradiction in the newfound militarism of the EU elites, how the biggest globalists suddenly became the champions of sovereignty. The sovereignty of Ukraine, the sovereignty of the EU as a whole, but not of the member states, of course. So what do you make of this ideological posturing on the global stage?
Well, I think at this particular time, the leaders of the different big Western European nations and the EU are panicking a little bit because their place in the world has been exposed by the election of Trump. Suddenly Europe realizes that it cannot pretend to be a major global player. It's got to do something. And although they've been talking a lot about strategic autonomy, it's always been all talk and no action. And now what they're doing is they're trying to kind of create the impression, and maybe that's genuinely what they want to do, that they're going to become these hardcore militarist nations. They're going to rearm, spend a lot of money on arms, and they think that in that kind of a way, they can give meaning to the sovereignty of certain nations, but particularly the sovereignty of the EU, which doesn't make very much sense, because sovereignty is rooted in a nation rather than a federal entity like that. And they are really not aware of one simple fact, that there is no Europe. There is Germany, there is France, there is Denmark, Holland. It's very difficult for all these nations to unite together. They haven't got the strength of conviction or the commitment or the loyalty to transcend their own national interest, to actually forge a genuine military alliance.
Recently, you wrote about the EU's return to military Keynesianism with the ReArm Europe program, saying that Europe has just become a more dangerous place. Why?
I think the problem is that the belief that somehow rearmament can solve some of the technological problems of Europe, their low productivity, that somehow armament can do what the Green Deal couldn't, because the green technology never actually stimulated the European economy. I think that's an illusion. But also I think what is dangerous is because if you are going to rearm and carry on with that in a genuine way, put a lot of money into that, the question then becomes, what do you do with all the stuff you produced? And you can't just have hundreds of tanks being parked in a somewhere in a shopping center in Frankfurt or in Paris. That doesn't really work. So there's a danger that at some point people will get the idea that now that we've gone so far, maybe we need to do something with this. It's a dangerous place because in the very act of rearming, you're inviting other people to be, to respond to that. So it's dangerous because if Russia sees that suddenly there's all these new rearmament programs kicking in, they might feel a little bit defensive or insecure. And what I'm really arguing is that rearmament, unless you have a strategic vision, can lead to the unraveling of the way that geopolitics is organized, and its consequences are very difficult, if not impossible, to predict.
So it's no surprise that the EU is famous for using crises to advance its centralizing agenda. And even though the mainstream media has been talking about Brussels' Hamiltonian moment, as in a joint debt spiral will force the bloc to move towards a federalist concept, a federalist state. Do you also think this could be the ultimate goal, from ReArm Europe to ReForm Europe?
Well, I think there are different dynamics at play. And I think you're right that there is a tendency to use debt and borrowing as a way of bringing together the financial systems of Europe, as a way of forging bonds, economic bonds between them. Because if the money that's being borrowed is borrowed for Europe, rather than for a particular nation, it then becomes the responsibility of every member state. They have to pay up for that. So it does kind of create a federalist dynamic, and there's an imperative towards moving in that kind of direction. So there is that, and I think that that's very much in play on the financial side. However, on the political side, it's much more difficult to take a lot of new steps forward in relation to rearmament, for a very simple reason that within Europe there's a lot of positioning, in the sense that France wants to be the leader of a rearmed Europe, so does Germany. A lot of the other nations aren't very happy with being the vassal states of these bigger European nations. So it's going to take some doing to actually forge something more than a dead base unity. And that's not real unity, it's a unity in desperation. And therefore, I don't think that at this particular moment in time, the conditions have been created to make that kind of qualitative step forward in the federalist project.
Mr. László, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the viewers who tuned in.
There have been some concrete developments in terms of the US-led Ukraine peace process in the past few weeks, but as we see, instead of helping these efforts, the EU is doing the exact opposite. So why is Brussels so bent on continuing the war?
EU elites in Brussels have pushed for this war for 3 years. Hungary has been supportive of Ukraine since day one, but at the same time we also demanded that we and the EU make efforts to have also peace talks as soon as possible to end this war as soon as possible. Unfortunately, now that there's a new US administration trying to achieve peace, trying to bring a new approach, new strategic approach to this war, to Russian relations, to security architecture in general in Europe, EU leaders are unwilling to change policy, unwilling to adopt to a new strategic approach of the United States. And for this reason, we are kept out of the peace talks. But this wouldn't normally be a problem. EU leaders or EU heads of government could in fact engage in peace talk or make initiatives by themselves, yet they still refuse to do that as well. So they complain about the peace talks the US is conducting, but they're not making any efforts themselves. I think this is mostly due to the fact that the EU has invested so much politically and financially into this war that it's totally unacceptable for them to do a 180-degree turn. And for this reason, we're continuing down a road which has not been able to solve or save Ukraine in the last 3 years. And there's absolutely no vision or strategic understanding on behalf of top EU institutions and leaders and major governments in Europe on what needs to be done, what is the interest of Europe, and how we can restore long-term peace in Europe, not just in the EU, but in Europe as a whole. This is very sad because this is why the EU integration process was created in the 50s, to have peace and prosperity in Europe. Unfortunately, we have completely derailed from these original objectives. Our intention is to put Europe back on track for the purpose of which it was created, which is peace and prosperity in Europe. This is the right way.
Whenever there's talk about Ukraine, Hungary and Slovakia are depicted as the only outliers, with the mainstream media portraying them or describing them as Europe's pro-Russia bloc. Yet there's not even talks about or them trying to describe their actual stance on the matter. So I would like to take this opportunity and ask you, what is the Hungarian approach regarding the war?
We want peace as soon as possible. We want a lasting peace, which means a deal that is acceptable both to Ukraine, both to Russia, both to European partners, and the United States as well. These are the major parties to this war. We need to come to an agreement. We have initiated peace talks at the beginning of the Hungarian presidency of the Council of the European Union. This was highly criticized by the new European Parliament, which was just formed at the same time in July last year. There's absolutely no will and no initiative on behalf of EU institutions to have peace talks. We want peace in Europe, and for that, we need to negotiate with the other side. Unfortunately, EU governments and most EU diplomats have become accustomed to a style of diplomacy where they only talk to people they agree with, and they criticize those who they don't agree with. And of course, it's the easiest to criticize Hungary and Slovakia or in whatever country for whatever reason, because then they don't have to talk about their strategic failure in terms of their approach to Ukraine. 3 years now, they have promised that they will bring Ukraine to victory with military help, with financial help, with economic help, and it was all a disaster. The situation is getting worse, and instead of finding a political solution, they keep on pushing and investing into a bottomless pit, which this war is. Resources and money and political capital with no prospect of success. This is very discouraging as a European citizen, also as a European lawmaker. Sometimes it is the job of decision makers to take difficult decisions, which they might not like, which they might not agree with, which might not be seen as their immediate interest. But at the same time, we cannot make policy which is totally disconnected from reality on the ground. And unfortunately, this is what the European Union is doing right now. Hungary and Slovakia are speaking up against this, so they're pointing the finger at us. The reality is, if they had a solution for Ukraine, they would be talking about that. Because they don't have one, they're finding scapegoats to blame for their own failures.
If you look at the last European Council summit, it seems that the narrative that there's only Hungary against 26 united countries is slowly breaking apart. The latest 40 billion euro military aid package was removed due to vetoes from France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and Macron's peacekeeping coalition, or as we call it, the coalition of the unwilling, is also struggling to find countries who would be actually willing to send troops to Ukraine. Do you see these developments as Europe catching up with reality?
I think national governments in the EU are catching up with reality, not EU institutions. So when national leaders come to Brussels, there's this atmosphere of let's say, of a blank check approach towards Ukraine. They feel the need to promise everything. Maybe they are afraid of the media, maybe they are afraid of what their colleagues will say. But when they go back home and they make the calculation, what would be the domestic political effect of their decision of sending either military people to soldiers to Ukraine or sending more armaments, and what consequences that would have on their own security, they realize that what they say might sound nice in Brussels and in mainstream media and towards European partners, but in fact they can't deliver on this. This is the whole very sad story of the EU's approach to the Ukraine war. They want to take a moralistic approach to a very concrete and material and real problem which is on the ground, which is the lack of European funding now for this war, the lack of European defense industrial capabilities to produce the material needed in this war, and also the absolute failure of European diplomacy to get countries which don't belong to the Western sphere to join either sanctions or military efforts or any other kind of approach which is promoted by the EU. This is how reality is kicking in. As long as there was the Biden administration in the United States, which was ready to give more weapons also and more money, then the EU could tag along and just follow that line. But that was a strategy based on the slogan, as long as it takes, which is totally meaningless. And when you're fighting a war in the name of Ukraine, which is a smaller country, against a larger country, a long war is not in your interest. European leaders thought and probably wanted to provide all the material necessary for Ukraine to win this war, although that was never defined what that means. But they have failed to do that, and now they must face the consequences at home because they understand, slowly, but they're beginning to understand the very severe limitations EU militaries have and EU economies have in continuing this war without American support.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned because we'll be back soon with more episodes discussing topics that are of special interest to European citizens.